Upton Forum was designed to advance student understanding of the nature and causes of wealth and well-being. The forum is named after the 6th president of Beloit College, Miller Upton, who was an economist by training. He was an advocate of the ideals of the liberal society, political freedom, the rule of law, and the promotion of peace and prosperity through the voluntary exchange of goods, services, and ideas.
Thanks to all of you, to Laura, to Julie, everyone else who put this fantastic event together. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm especially thrilled to be honoring my mentor, Mark Granovetter. I'm going to talk today about a theoretical issue that's been at the center of my thinking since I was an undergraduate. And I'm going to talk about my own experience with this and also the influence of Mark's ideas at every stage. So to start, I want to talk about the view of human action that dominated the field of sociology back in the middle of the 20th century, particularly in the 1950s and to some extent the 60s. This is what today is sometimes called the normative perspective. And the basic idea here was that social order was primarily a function of shared values and shared norms. Values being generalized beliefs about good and bad, right and wrong, and norms being expectations of behavior. The idea that, we say please and thank you, we hold the door open for people, things that we just kind of take for granted. And this was it was a widely held view, but there was more to it than just the idea that people had to share norms and values. It was also necessary for this model to work that the norms be internalized, meaning that they were part of our gut, really, that we didn't even think about it most of the time when we followed them. And the reason norms had to be internalized is because we're not always being watched. Sure, we can do the right thing, the quote right thing, when we're being observed by others, but what happens when we're not being observed? And, for example, well, I guess we could put police on every corner, but then who would police the police? And so the argument here was that on some level, these norms had to be internalized for any social order to function, basically. And how do we tell that these internalized norms exist? Well, one way is through the fact that we have a conscience, right? If you feel bad about, if you do something wrong, you feel bad about it, or you would feel bad, and so you don't do it in the first place. So anyway, by the way, I am not getting, this happens to me all the time, I'm not getting my slides to correspond with my talking. Anyway, the concept of internalized norms was sociology's answer to the Hobbesian question. And this was Thomas Hobbes asking, why is there not a war of all against all? And the solution for Hobbes was you needed to have a strong centralized state to keep people in line. The solution for economics is the market. The solution to sociologists was internalized norms. Okay? So I would argue that this view has a lot to recommend it. I mean, if we didn't internalize norms to a certain extent, you couldn't get through the day. I mean, just think about when you came into the building today. I'm guessing if somebody was in front of you that they probably didn't turn around and hold the door closed so you couldn't get in, right? I mean, maybe they even held the door open for you. We say please and thank you. A lot of these things in our daily lives, we just take for granted. We don't even think about them. And again, this is how society works for the most part. So I think that there's a lot to be said for this normative perspective. On the other hand, sometimes we do think about these things. However stable and uneventful our daily activities might be, there are plenty of places in the world, plenty of situations in which things are not so stable and people don't necessarily follow norms, where conflict or even violence occurs. And in these situations, we often can't count on others to be acting according to norms. There's also an analytical problem with this perspective, and that's that it's almost impossible in many cases to know if norms have been internalized. So an example I like to use in my classes is, I call it the candy bar in the store example. So somebody is in the store and they see a candy bar and they don't steal it. And the question is, why didn't the person steal the candy bar? And there are a whole range of possible answers, one of which is they thought they'd get caught and they were worried about that. Another is they had internalized the norm. They wouldn't even think about stealing a candy bar. What's interesting about this, though, is by just observing the fact that the person doesn't steal the candy bar, we have no idea why. And we certainly have no idea that they've internalized a norm against it. So one big problem is I don't want to say never, but we often, in fact, in most cases, don't know if the norm has been internalized, even if people are following it. And then there's an additional problem, which is, we believe certain things, we want to do certain things. It doesn't mean that we actually will. So our thoughts don't necessarily result in actions. And, there are lots of people who support the goals of a particular social movement who are not going to actually engage in activism. And this is a problem economists know well. They call it the free rider problem. It's one reason that economists like to use the concept of revealed preferences. How do we know what people want? Look at what they do. That'll tell us, right? So here is where Mark enters the story. So there's a classic book by a former colleague of mine, Herbert Gans, called The Urban Villagers. And one of the key parts of that book was he's trying to understand, he was studying the West End in Boston, which was an impoverished neighborhood at the time. And the city decided to raise the neighborhood. They basically tore it down to put a highway through it. And Gans was interested in why wasn't there any protest? And his argument was, well, the culture of that community just didn't lend itself to that kind of activity. And the quote, in fact, a quote from his article where he's arguing back and forth with Mark, Gans says, they would have looked foolish to kin and peer group members if they had indulged in such, quote, abnormal behavior. So anyway, Mark wrote a critique of this article, of this book, and it wasn't really a critique of the book. I mean, it's a great book. But one point he suggested was, in the analysis, there was, it was clear that the neighborhood had these cohesive friendship and kinship ties. And so, but in a sense, they were very insular. And what Mark suggested is one possible reason that the community wasn't able to mobilize to fight the urban renewal was that they lacked connectors, people who connected the different closely tied groups. And so this concept of weak ties, now, he didn't have proof that that was the case, but it's another way of looking at things. In other words, even if these people had been motivated to try to engage politically to try to oppose this policy, if they didn't have these weak ties connecting the different groups, it probably would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to mobilize. So this suggested a kind of structural view of how things work rather than relying on cultural ideas or subjective states. And I found that very persuasive. Okay, then a few years later, Mark published an article where I have two examples, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to give you one. Imagine that there's a group of students who are really angry about something, and not here at Beloit, but some other school. And they congregate on the main quad of the campus, and they're protesting. And as I said, they're very angry and agitated. And then somebody throws a rock and breaks a window. Now, here's the thing. There are some people who, if one person had thrown the rock and broken the window, they would have joined in and started committing violent acts themselves. But there are others for whom it would have taken, say, 2 or more people to do this before they would have joined in. And what Mark argued in this paper was, if you look at the distribution, he called these thresholds, how many other people have to, so imagine you're in a boring talk and you really want to leave, but you don't want to be the first one to do it. But if other people start walking out, then you're willing to do it. So the question is, given the distribution of thresholds, what you could have completely different outcomes. In one case, if nobody has a threshold of greater than, of less than 2, of less than one or fewer, then this person who threw the rock is considered, oh, they get carted away and that's the end of it. The demonstration remains peaceful. But if one other person had a threshold of 2 or 1 and they did something violent, and then other people had thresholds of 2 and they joined in, you could have had a full-scale riot. And so this was another really interesting kind of alternative to a normative perspective, because you've got a whole bunch of people in the situation, they're all angry, they're all feeling the same thing, and yet just depending on this distribution of propensities to act, you could get completely different outcomes. Then, a few years later, Mark published what is probably the most important article ever published in the field of economic sociology. And in this article, he begins by critiquing this normative approach that I was just describing, and he refers to it as over-socialized, which is a term that had been used by a guy named Dennis Wrong in an earlier article. The idea being that it's over-socialized because the assumption is if people have internalized norms, they're always going to obey the norms regardless of the situation. But he also was critical of what he called under-socialized conceptions. And these are the ones presumably held by at least neoclassical economists, where the assumption is people are going to operate in their self-interest. And again, it's not going to vary. Obviously, your utility, your preferences are you're going to have different choices depending on the situation you're in, but the preferences you have in general are seen as fixed. And so so he's critical of both of these positions. And the person he focuses on is Oliver Williamson, who was a kind of iconoclastic economist who did eventually win the Nobel Prize. He was known for transaction cost economics. And the argument that Williamson made is that one reason that it's difficult to operate in markets, so you have a firm buying from a supplier, one reason it's difficult is because there's the potential for opportunism between the actors. So if you're a customer and you need inputs and you buy from a particular supplier, that person can behave opportunistically to you, creating transaction costs, which for Williamson basically were just the extent to which you're being ripped off. It wasn't, Coase, I don't think ever used the term, but his conception of it was a little bit different from Williamson's. But in any case, the idea was that these opportunistic relations were endemic in market transactions. And they also operated inside firms because your employees could take advantage of you or other people in the firm. And so, but what Mark argued is in a lot of these market transactions, the people actually know each other. They come to, they deal with each other frequently, and they come to, they in many cases become friends. And in those situations, they're less likely to behave opportunistically, to take advantage of one another. And that this can operate inside firms as well. So basically what he's doing is he's adding an additional key component of this, which is that you need to look at the social relations among the actors to understand the extent to which opportunism may or may not exist. Okay? Now, it turns out there were a couple of very interesting points in this article. This is the 1985 AJS article, for those of you keeping score at home. There are a couple of very interesting aspects of this article that have received a lot less attention than maybe they could have. And one has to do with what Marx says about the role of rational action. And here's a quote from the article, and Mark's not, he's going to say that he shouldn't have said this, but he did say it. What he says is, I suggest that while the assumption of rational action must always be problematic, it is a good working hypothesis that should not easily be abandoned. What looks to the analyst like non-rational behavior may be quite sensible when situational constraints are fully appreciated. I always loved this line. You know, this is like you read some of these anthropologists and they're looking at, you know, tribes in Africa who have magical rituals, and, you know, maybe Westerners look at those rituals and think they're ridiculous or crazy, but the anthropologists explain how they make total sense in the context in which people are operating. So I always thought this was a really good argument. The issue, the only real criticism he raises of it there is that, okay, you have to look at the context within which action is occurring to understand, to be able to see that the action may be rational. And then there's what he has to say about internalized norms, and this is another great quote. He refers to the legendary and possibly apocryphal, I can't read it, 10, 5? Are you serious? Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna really have to run through this. Okay, the legendary economist who against all economic rationality leaves a tip in a roadside restaurant far from home. I mean, right, people do this. So I'm gonna have to skip over a lot of this to get to the end, but what I'm gonna say is I don't have a problem with this stuff about rational choice. I think that, again, seeing it within a particular context can be useful. It doesn't mean you have to believe literally that people actually are rational. It's just a working assumption. Even economists will tell you that. But there's also this issue of internalized norms. And what Mark argues there is, yeah, the tip in the roadside diner does illustrate internalized norms, but it's very rare that you can actually observe things like this. Okay, I got probably about 2 minutes to do the final 2/3 of my talk. So here's my candy bar in the store example, and the top one is the pure utilitarianism. You steal the candy bar and you're happy. And at the bottom is the pure internalization story, which is it never even occurs to you to steal it. And then there are variations of it in between. But anyway, this is where Mark was circa the mid-1980s. But then something kind of strange happens. He writes this, there's an economist named Bob Gibbons at MIT he's made a career out of taking loosely formulated sociological ideas and developing economic models of them. And he did this for a famous article in organizational theory by a guy named Michel Crozier called The Bureaucratic Phenomenon. And Mark wrote a critique of it. And listen to this. Much of Crozier's organization is to be explained by the institutional and cultural setting. The actions reflect deeply rooted aspects of French culture. We need to understand interaction, this should be among, historical, normative, and cultural elements. Is this the same guy who was going after Herb Gans because there was too much emphasis on the culture of the community? Like, what's going on here? He goes on and on. The good behavior based on internalized norm is poorly captured by economic models of rational choice. Norms project an aura of being right and proper, quite aside from any advantages gained by following them. Networks are endogenous to historical and political institutions. What's going on here? Has Mark actually become a culturalist after all? And it continues in his 2017 book. What I will say is, the answer to that question is probably no. That it's a difference in emphasis, but he's still saying the key issue here is the social structure, and that behavior and conformity to norms is going to vary based on that social structure. So perhaps his views haven't changed after all. And then we get to the end of the story, which is how this affects me. Well, I was originally like, is this Mark Granovetter, when I read his critique of Gibbons? And then I read his manuscript for the publisher of the Society and Economy book. I was like, he's saying that networks don't take causal priority? What's going on here? The argument I would make is, it's a chicken and egg question, right? Structure versus norms and attitudes. But you have to start somewhere. And analytically, I would argue that starting with structure and interest, and even potentially using rational choice theory within that structure is a potentially, I think it's a more effective approach than starting with culture and norms. Now, again, Mark isn't starting with culture and norms, but he's giving them more priority than I would have expected. So how this fits in is that I have actually kind of, even though I was a little bit critical of Mark there, although read my quote on the back dust jacket of his book, and you'll see that I was actually, very favorable about what he was doing. But I'm going to skip over the thing about my own book, but I want to talk about how this affects our current situation. So there's a book by two political scientists, Levitsky and Ziblatt, about how democracies die. And here's a quote from a University of Michigan law professor. You may have seen her on CNN, Barbara McQuaid. And this is just a couple weeks ago. She said, I spent almost 20 years of my life working for the Department of Justice during a time when it was the North Star that you do not use federal prosecution to go after political rivals. And it seems that Pam Bondi is turning that on its head. Now, it's a norm, it's not a law, but since Watergate, it's been crystal clear that that is the way that prosecutors conduct themselves. Now, the key point here is she says there's nothing in the law that prevents the government from doing this. They've only restrained themselves because it's a norm. And what Levitsky and Ziblatt have argued is American democracy can only work if political actors adhere to norms that in theory they could breach and actually are being breached now. So yes, it's a conditional phenomenon, and there are conditions under which the norms will or will not be breached. But for me, after years of denial, I have to say that I stand corrected. Norms matter. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So I am a professor of economic sociology at UT Austin. But before that, I was a student right here at Beloit College. And I first encountered Professor Granovetter's work. Yes. So I first encountered Professor Granovetter's work in a class at Beloit on social capital, where we read his classical article, The Strength of Weak Ties. So in this class, we were asked to write an essay that put his ideas into conversation with other scholars, and then make an argument on who had offered the most convincing perspective. Now, I do not remember every paper that I wrote in college, but I remember this one because I got a B, and I was unhappy about that. So my professor said, you've summarized the ideas of others beautifully, but you need to take a stand. You need to make your own argument. So you can imagine how exciting and surreal it is to be here almost 20 years later, essentially redoing that assignment, in front of Mark Granovetter. Huh? It was a co-taught class with Charles Westerberg and Emily Chamley Wright. So sociology and economics. So basically, I've been asked to reflect on Granovetter's influence on our field, but primarily by talking to you about my own recent research. So Granovetter is a foundational figure in economic sociology, and many of his ideas have shaped the way that I think. But today I basically want to focus on ideas from his more recent work on social institutions, as laid out in Chapter 5 of his 2017 book, Society and Economy, Frameworks and Principles. So in that chapter, Granovetter highlights a core tension. So on the one hand, institutions, right? The rules, norms, shared understandings that guide behavior. Institutions have a powerful influence on economic life. As Frank Dobbin put it, people may be self-interested, but the concept of self-interest is of little use in explaining why people behave differently in different places. So institutions help us make sense of those differences. They include things like the political system that shapes who gets to make economic decisions, the labor laws and welfare regimes that shape how people work and how they get paid, and then the family structures and gender norms that influence who earns, who cares, and how households divide resources. So in short, institutions are often the key to explaining variation in economic life across societies. And yet, here's the tension. Institutions don't determine everything. They aren't destiny. Early sociologists sometimes acted as if people just follow the norms and rules of their societies unthinkingly or automatically. But now we know that that's not how institutions work. People are creative. They interpret the rules, they bend the rules, or they even resist the rules around them. And institutions themselves evolve. They change, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. And as Granovetter reminds us, this presents a big challenge for the institutionally minded sociologist. How can we both recognize institutions as these powerful forces that structure the wealth and well-being of nations, and also recognize that they're constantly being contested, reinterpreted, and transformed? So to explore this issue, Granovetter looked at the rise and fall of modular production systems in the auto industry. And his argument, greatly simplified here, is this. Like, yes, institutions matter, but they can also break down when creative actors realize that they're no longer solving the problems they face. When that happens, people seek alternatives. They look for workarounds. They invent new models. So I wrestle with this same tension in my own research, but from a different angle. So like Granovetter, I see institutions fall apart when they stop working. But I argue that how national institutions are dismantled and rebuilt is still shaped by deeply rooted national traditions in ways that scholars haven't fully recognized, but should. So my focus is on financial regulation. The rules that countries create to govern their banking systems and how those rules have evolved over time. Financial regulation matters because it's the best tool that we have to try to avoid the financial meltdowns that lead to such disruption and devastation in societies. I trace the development of regulation, financial regulation, across 3 countries over the course of 200 years. And what I find is this, that what national policymakers and stakeholders fight about within countries is remarkably consistent. That is, national debates over financial regulation tend to follow recurring patterns, patterns that show up again and again across historical periods. These conflicts are shaped by each country's institutional environment. And recognizing this helps to explain how otherwise hard to explain things about why financial systems evolve in such distinctive and surprising ways are unfolding. So in my recent book, Visions of Financial Order, I ask what seems like a simple question. In the years leading up to the 2008 global financial crisis, why were regulators in some countries so much more effective than others in restraining risky bank behavior? To answer this question, I trace how financial regulation developed in 3 countries, so the US, Canada, and Spain in the 1990s and the 2000s. All 3 operated under the same international regulatory framework, the Basel Capital Accord, and yet regulators still made very different choices about regulation in practice. So to simplify a pretty complex story here, the US in this period took a permissive approach to banking regulation. Canada adopted more cautious, moderate rules, and Spain had the strictest regulation of the 3. So these regulatory differences don't explain everything, but they did matter. They go a long way towards explaining why banks in each country fared so differently during the crisis. And at first glance, this comparative pattern seems to fit a classic institutional pattern. In the US, policymakers have long emphasized free markets and limited government intervention, and that orientation was clearly on display in the regulatory realm. In Canada, a more cautious but still quite market-friendly approach also aligns with earlier traditions. And then in Spain, where the state has historically played a more active role in coordinating markets, a stricter stance fits that legacy too. So far, so good, right? All of this seems to line up with what we know about each country's typical institutional playbook. But here's the puzzle. Just a few decades earlier, these countries had taken very different approaches to financial regulation. So between the 1930s and the 1980s, the US had one of the strictest bank regulatory systems in the world, hardly laissez-faire. And Americans were comparatively slow to begin deregulating this financial system. Canada led the way with a much more hands-off, self-regulatory approach, and Spain's regulatory stance shifted significantly between the 1960s and the 1980s. So in other words, the institutional logic flipped. The usual suspects weren't behaving as expected. And that raises a key question once again. If institutions are supposed to be these powerful forces that lock countries into stable policy paths, how do we explain such sharp reversals? What triggered these major transformations in banking regulation between the 1970s and the 1990s? So to explain this shift, I offer a new way of thinking about institutions and how they work to shape policymaking. I argue that national institutions encompass multiple and sometimes competing principles of order. So principles of order are deeply held understandings about what makes an economy stable and prosperous. And they're not just floating around out there. They're embedded in the form of long-standing political institutions and economic arrangements. And they shape what policymakers see as reasonable and legitimate, not by dictating a single choice, but by narrowing the range of options that feel acceptable or possible. In the 1990s and 2000s, I find that each country's financial regulatory system was organized around one dominant principle of order. In the US, this was the principle of competition, the belief that markets work best when the state steps back and lets competition alone drive outcomes. In Canada, it was the principle of public rights, the idea that the state must actively protect the rights of vulnerable individuals and groups. And in Spain, it was the principle of state sovereignty, this belief that the state must guide and coordinate markets to maintain economic order. And I show that these principles directly influence the different choices that banking regulators made in this period, with very important consequences. But, and here's the key, they weren't the only principles available to policymakers. Each country had other institutional legacies regulators could have drawn on. They just weren't dominant in that moment. And so if we look further back, we see that a very different set of principles once held sway. So in the 1930s to the 1980s, the US regulatory system was organized around the principle of community sovereignty, the idea that the state should proactively protect local control and prevent concentrated power. And Canadian regulation reflected the principle of elite autonomy, or the idea that stability and prosperity come from letting elite private actors govern themselves, free from state interference. And Spanish regulation operated under the principle of corporatist harmony, favoring cooperation between social groups coordinated by the state. So these principles, too, were deeply institutionally rooted. They make up the other part of the country's institutional toolkit. And after the 1980s, they didn't disappear. They just became latent, toppled by a different but still familiar principle of order. So what causes these shifts from one dominant principle to another within regulatory systems? In all three countries, a turning point was the devastating banking crises of the 1980s. These crises revealed that the old regulatory systems weren't working, and that disruption created space for actors pushing new alternative ideas, just as Granovetter describes in the auto industry. When institutions stop solving real problems, they can break down, and new models will emerge. But my argument goes a step further. These new models weren't random. They were institutionally structured. They were shaped by each country's broader institutional environment, by a previously latent principle of order. So overall, I find that institutions define a bounded set of options for policymakers. And that's why over the course of 200 years, we see the same fights or debates constantly resurfacing within countries. In the US, this conflict is between market competition and community sovereignty. In Canada, between elite autonomy and public rights. And in Spain, between corporatist harmony and state sovereignty. And I saw these same conflicts play out not just in the 1980s, but in the 1780s, in the 1860s, in the 1920s, and in other periods. So in other words, regulatory systems can change, even dramatically, but the core tensions within nations remain remarkably consistent. And this produces a pattern of institutional evolution that's both dynamic and distinctly national. And that matters, right? Because it can explain why countries facing similar crises can arrive at very different outcomes. And it reminds us that the wealth and well-being of nations depends not just on market forces, but on the deeper institutional structures that shape what kinds of regulatory support or change are even thinkable. All right, so the organizers of this panel asked me to end with an unanswered question. So I'm gonna close with one that's at the heart of my own research. So Professor Granovetter and I agree that social structure, including in the form of institutions, matters deeply for understanding the wealth and well-being of nations. We also agree that crises, or more precisely, institutions not working, often plays a pivotal role in institutional change. But as I researched my book, I found something surprising. The objective severity of a crisis didn't always predict whether change happened, and certainly not the type of change. So yes, the banking crises of the 1980s triggered major regulatory overhauls in all three of these countries. But in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, regulators also faced intense pressure to adjust banking regulation, yet often responded with only minor tweaks. In those moments, they basically doubled down on the status quo. So what does that tell us? It tells us that just like institutions don't mechanically dictate behavior, crises don't automatically dismantle institutions either. Crises have to be interpreted, and different interpretations can lead in very different policy directions. So the unanswered question I'll leave you with is this: why do some crises spark transformation while others reinforce the status quo? What shapes how crisis is interpreted and acted upon? So we still have a lot to learn about this process, obviously, right? But it's also important to understand, because the wealth and well-being of nations are often rebuilt or not in these important moments. Thank you.
It is a real pleasure to be here. I get to have a talk in one of my favorite places, and I get to talk about one of my favorite scholars, and so that is extremely cool. That I met Mark 25 years ago. He does not remember meeting me, but I certainly remember meeting him. We've corresponded some since. He's actually been tremendously kind to me at various stages in my career. But this is only the second time that I'm getting to speak in front of him. The first time I spoke in front of him was 25 years ago when we met. I was a young graduate student, which means that I was just a few years out of Beloit. And so that meant the confidence, let's say, that you carry with you as a Beloit graduate was in full force. And so what that translated into was, as a graduate student, that I got up in a room, a little bit different than this one, but filled with faces looking at me like this one. And I was bold enough to criticize a paper by Mark, a paper that by the time, when I was criticizing it, was already recognized as a seminal paper in the emergence of an entire field, with Mark in the audience staring back at me. He need not have been, but he was amazingly kind then, that gently pointing out that, you know, how I, maybe the graduate student, was perhaps mistaken, and him, the eminent professor, was probably correct. the fresh out of Beloit confidence has faded a bit, replaced with the humility and prudence that Beloit also tried to teach me, but took a little bit longer to stick. Sort of came with the grays. But today I want to talk about that same article. But this time, no critique, all entirely or. And the article is the one that Mark M. mentioned, Economic Action and Social Structure, the Problem of Embeddedness. It's his, I think, second most famous article. It's certainly, I think, I agree with Mark that it's his most important article. But I'm going to try to say something new about it, maybe. If you can say something new about an article that has 55,000 citations, which is a career's worth of citations for any other scholar. But even if I can't say something new, I hope to say something old, but maybe in a slightly new way. And so my argument is that Granovetter in that article teaches us that embedded is an adjective and a verb, meaning embedded describes a type of actor. It conveys something useful about what an act is like, in the same way that calling a person tall or handsome or smart or West Indian, conveys something about what kind of actor it is. An embedded actor is a particular kind of actor. Some of what I'm going to say is going to try to explain what kind of actor an embedded actor really is, what that adjective says about the subjects that are being talked about. But I also want to talk about embedded as a verb. In addition to being an adjective, in addition to being a descriptor, embedded can also express an action, something that is done perhaps by an actor or maybe to an actor, by the social structures in which he or she swims, or by the social scientists looking to understand them. An embedded actor is an actor that is being changed or was changed. So embedded can be an adjective or a verb. Embedded can be an adjective or a verb. So what is embedded as an adjective? What did Mark mean when he was describing embedded economic actors? What kind of descriptor is embedded? Mark, you might recall, begins his article by talking about two big mistakes that social scientists make when we describe actors. One mistake is to describe them as over-socialized. That is, to describe economic actors as social automatons, as robots with a particular kind of program that they can't deviate from, they can't shift from, they can't move away from. Essentially, some sort of mindless actor that's following a script with no room to do anything other than to say the words that are on the page. This, Mark points out in that article, is a descriptive mistake. It's a mistake that sometimes anthropologists and sociologists make. It's also a mistake that sometimes economists make. But this way of describing human beings as social automatons is just wrong. Human beings don't behave like that. That's not what we're like. That Beloit, when I was a student, it turns out it's still true now, was then, is now one of the politest places in the world. People say good morning and good evening. They say, hello when you walk in the room. They say please and thank you. Now they say, excuse me, sir, which is quite, but some mornings, and with some people, it's harder to give the proper greeting. And some mornings, some people simply don't say hello. That this was me when I was a student from the Bahamas, anytime the temperature got below 0 degrees. It was sort of, I moved from polite to rude. But we care about the opinions of others, but we aren't overwhelmingly sensitive to the opinions of others. We follow norms, perhaps most of the time, but not all of the time, and not ever precisely. The other mistake that social scientists sometimes make is to describe actors as under-socialized. That is, to describe actors as atoms, unaffected by social structures, describing actors as isolated creatures unaffected by their connections to their families or their friends or their communities. They're all ego in this way of describing actors, disconnected, separate. Economists will confess, are frequent purveyors of this particular poor description of actors. That even if you've taken Econ 199 and you've taken it with a good professor, you are unlikely to be introduced to supply and demand with any discussion of who consumers were related to, or who the producers went to college with, or how the goods that people buy and sell were shaped by their parents or where they work or their social situations. But as we all know, people aren't isolated atoms. To describe them as atoms is a mistake. Rather than over or under socialized, then Mark urges us to describe actors as embedded. Quote, actors do not behave or decide as atoms outside a social context, nor do they adhere slavishly to a script written for them by the particular intersection of social categories that they happen to occupy. Their attempts at purposive action are instead embedded in concrete, ongoing systems of social relations. Embedded in the sense of embedded actors or embedded actions is certainly an adjective. And it's a part of that article that I think most people who read it get. But as the quote suggests, hints at really, that embedded is also a verb. Perhaps in two ways, both interesting, but one probably better appreciated than the other. The one that's more appreciated is that embedding actors is methodological advice to those who are trying to make sense of the world. When we study actors, we shouldn't pretend like they're robots who are programmed in such a way that they can't do anything but follow their programming. And we shouldn't treat them as atoms either. We shouldn't model them as what Nobel laureate Amartya Sen calls rational fools. That we should treat them as actors who are socially connected and whose social connections matter to them as they negotiate the world. We should embed them. So here embedded is a verb that has to do with treating our subjects a certain kind of way. We embed them. The equally interesting, but maybe less appreciated way to think about embedded as a verb is to think about how market actors are impacted by their ongoing social relations, and critically how they develop ongoing social relations in market contexts. When Mark says that actors are embedded, he means that they are affected by their situations and circumstances in a particular kind of way. One way is that they are changed by being embedded. And one way that they're changed by being embedded is they come to trust one another and to develop mechanisms that limit malfeasance. The reason that embedded leads to the development of trust is connected to another observation that Mark makes in that article, is that we tend to have a preference for interacting with people who we've interacted with before. It's a natural human tendency, amongst other things. The quote, continuing economic relations, Mark writes, often becomes overlaid with social content that carries strong expectations of trust and abstention from opportunism. Stated another way, we can and do develop social connections with people we interact with in markets. And because we like to interact with people we've interacted with before, to go to restaurants that we've gone to before, to shop in stores where we've shopped in before, there's a likelihood that we'll develop meaningful social connections with those people. And that likelihood is pretty high. My co-author, frequent co-author, and I, Jenny Choi, follow Granovetter's advice to embed our actors in our work that tries to explain market friendships. As we observe, meaningful social connections can and do form in markets. And there are aspects of markets that make it likely that meaningful social connections can and will form in markets. Markets essentially put us in scenarios where we're able to learn a little bit about the people that we're interacting with every time we buy and sell. Every time we go to buy or go to sell, there's an opportunity to take without paying or to promise without delivering. And every time the person that we're trading with keeps their end of the bargain, every time they actually, keep the promise that they made or actually pay for the good that they received or deliver the thing that they said that they would, we learn something useful about them. We learn that they can be trusted and that our trust in them is well-founded. And every successful market interaction then teaches us the person that we're trading with may be someone that we want to form a deeper connection with. We see this quantitatively. In a series of economic experiments, Jenny and I put our experimental subjects in a market setting and help them trade with one another. And then after that, we put them in a social setting and help them interact with one another. And what we find is that trading pairs, groupings of buyers and sellers who had a positive set of interactions in the market setting, then exhibit trust and trustworthy behavior in the social setting. The embedded market actors can grow to trust one another. Similarly, in a series of surveys that we've done with people working age Americans, that we asked people about their friends, both where they met their friends and the intensity of their friendships. The people reported having met and formed close friendships with people that they work with at about the same rate that they report meeting and forming close relationships with people that they went to church with or they were in some other social setting with. And they report that the intensity of those workplace friendships was about the same as those friendships that they formed with people that they met in church or people that they met in some other social setting, that they were as likely to share details about themselves and private details about themselves. They were likely to be willing to help when others were, when their work friends were in difficult situations. Embedded market actors can become good friends. That we see this qualitatively too. In my book with Laura, actually, that looks at how communities recover from disaster, one of the things that it turned out to be true was that people relied on and turned to not only their family members when they were faced with a difficult challenge, and not only their neighbors when they were faced with a difficult challenge, but to their market friends when they were faced with a difficult challenge. That they were likely to help their family and they were likely to help their friends, but they were also likely to help the people that worked for them and to help the people who worked with them. And so embedded market actors can rely on each other, both in and outside market settings. We were able to see this. We were able to see this possibility that deep, meaningful social connections can form in a market setting because Mark taught us that embedded is also a verb that speaks to how actors are affected by their interactions within markets. Grammar, really vocabulary, is essential for talking about and so understanding social phenomena. The more expansive our vocabulary, the more clearly and precisely we can speak. Recognizing that embedded can be an adjective and a verb, as Mark calls us to do, adds to our vocabulary and makes us better able to make sense of the world. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I guess I can be glad that there's not a picture of my book on the screen, because then I would have to say a lot about it, but I'll try to say something intelligent. I'm very fortunate to have such interesting respondents discussing my work, as Mark Mizruchi, Kim Parnell, and Virgil Storr, and each one talked about somewhat different things. So the challenge for me is to try to pull all this together. And the thing that I think is most relevant here that I could talk about is my understanding and how it's changed over time. I've been fortunate to have a long career. The misfortune about that, in some sense, is that people can point to a certain stage in your career when you thought X, and then they can point to a different stage in your career when you thought Y, which is the opposite of X, and they can say, well, he's just completely incoherent. So how can I explain the way in which my thought has evolved over time in relation to some of the things that these excellent discussants I've talked about. So let me say a little bit about my history. When I began my graduate studies in sociology, the field was dominated by a theorist named Talcott Parsons that Mark Mizruchi referred to. And Parsons is a name that if I were talking in the 1950s or the 1960s, everyone in the audience would know exactly who I was talking about. They would have read all his work, and now that's no longer true. I'll bet. Well, let's try this. How many of you have heard of Talcott Parsons? So that's about 5% of you. And how many of you have read some of his work? Well, that's about 3% of you. That's not precise, but I think it's fairly close. At the time that I was a graduate student, he was the most important theorist in the field. And as Mark Mizruchi pointed out, he had a theory in which everything had to do with values that were held by everyone in the society, and those values held the society together. And the fact that there were actual people or individuals in the picture was kind of secondary for Parsons. He didn't actually ever talk about particular individuals, at least during most of his career. So when I became a graduate student, he was toward the end of his career, and I would say it was probably toward the end of his influence. And so those of us who were graduate students at the time were in rebellion. Some of us were in rebellion against these ideas. And part of the reason that we were in rebellion is that to have a sociological argument that didn't have any people in it seemed like it had to be at some very basic level confused. Now, none of these three speakers here are confused in that way, and they all talked about the importance of individuals, but they also talked about the importance of larger scale social patterns. And so the conundrum for sociologists is always, how do we figure out what the relationship is between the small scale, which is individual people like you and me and all the other people around? How do we explain the relationship between that and larger scale issues like systems of norms and national differences in how people think about the world? How do we somehow bridge that gap? Now, I think for a long time, one of the ways that people tried to bridge that gap was by talking about social networks. And that is certainly the way I began my career. There's a paper of mine that some of you know about called The Strength of Weak Ties, which has this, as you perhaps have heard, ungodly number of citations. Unfortunately, unlike those who write music and their song is played on the radio or it's downloaded through Spotify, they get royalties. They get 20 cents or 50 cents every time somebody downloads a song or plays the song. And although it doesn't sound like much, if it happens enough millions of times, then you are doing very well indeed. If you write a paper that has 78,000 citations, you get how much royalty for each time it's downloaded? For those of you who didn't hear that, it's 0. So it is very nice to know that people are so interested in your paper. And someone actually, I won't name them, in this group, said that what I should do is write a letter to each of those 78,000 people demanding a royalty of 50 cents or $1. I think that's a very nice idea, and I would suggest that the person who made that suggestion is probably the one who should do it on my behalf. Well, unfortunately, we can't do that. But so here we have this, all the speakers in one way or another, we're talking about this conundrum of how do you relate these large-scale issues of national differences in norms and values, which are clearly significant. Kim Parnell was talking about that in relation to the way large banks and financial institutions are regulated. People in different countries have very different ideas about the way that should be done. Canada, US, and Spain were her three examples. We could probably find another 12 countries and you'd see the same difference, although your book would be 4 times as long, and maybe that's not what your goal was. So I would say that, and by the way, this is our opportunity to finally give Kim the A that she deserved in that course. So if it were in my power to do that, well, I can just declare that that's what she deserves. So I think that earlier in my career, I thought, and Mark Mizruchi cited something I said in my 1985 paper about how we should think about the idea of rational behavior as something that makes a lot of sense and that we should adopt and we should take it more seriously. And in saying that, I think I was reacting against the kind of influence that Talcott Parsons had on the field. I was still, I guess, recovering from that. You know, it was like you have, there should have been some equivalent of Alcoholics Anonymous. It would be Parsons Anonymous. We would all get together and talk about how we could recover from his influence. And the way I tried to recover from his influence was by thinking that rational behavior made a lot of sense. And that's something I wrote 40 years ago. So I think you're entitled to have a change of heart after that period of time. And I think that what I would say now about that is that at that level of people thinking about what they're doing and how to accomplish it, it makes a lot of sense to take that into account. But I think there are several different levels of analysis that we have to think about. There is the larger scale level of national differences in the way you think about institutions. And that's what all the speakers in some way or another have talked about. And there is a kind of intermediate level of social networks. And that is something that I've spent a lot of my career talking about. And I think that it's true, and I think Mark Mizruchi referred to this, that in my 2017 book, I finally came around to the idea that while social networks are very important, they are never the most important thing. What they are is a level that is intermediate between large-scale differences in countries and sometimes supranational, but especially nations, because nations have particularly distinctive ways of thinking about the world. And then we have social networks, which is the way individual people are connected. And then at the bottom of this pyramid, if you want to think of it as a pyramid, which is perhaps misleading because it's one that there's not really anybody at any level at the top and another level at the bottom, but we have individuals trying to figure out what they're doing and how to do it. And I think that the intermediate level of social networks is important, mainly, I would say now, in the way it connects these large-scale institutions and ways of thinking about the world to the way individuals are making their way within these institutions and trying to figure out what to do. And then they get together with other people and they create social networks and they try to deal with those institutions. So it's a complicated issue to figure out how to talk about that. So one of the things that Kim Parnell talked about was my analysis in my 2017 book of the auto industry in the world. There were a series of papers in the Harvard Business Review that made the claim that the auto industry should, if it wanted to succeed, should do what the computer industry did, which was to create what was called modular production. Modular production means that there is one company that puts all the parts together of whatever the thing is that's being produced. And then there are a lot of other companies that they contract with to make each individual part. And then the big company, the IBM, for example, is they just put it all together. You know, all these other companies are suppliers, and then the big important company puts all the parts together. And that's how the industry is most efficiently organized, because then the big company doesn't have to produce all those individual parts. And so they thought, these articles thought, and you know, if any of you are in business, you know the Harvard Business Review is very influential, and when it publishes an article and says your industry should do X, then a lot of people in the industry decide that that's what they better do. And so when these articles came out in the 1980s and early 1990s saying that the auto industry ought to adopt modular production, they ought to farm out the production of all the different parts of the car to different companies, and those suppliers would then supply those parts, and then the auto companies would just put them all together and, you know, presto, there's a car. And so the executives of these firms, and maybe they were graduates of Harvard Business School, I'm not sure why they were so influenced by it, they looked at this and they said, yes, this is what we have to do. And they gave orders down the line that this should be the way to construct the cars. And it turned out that so if the CEOs and the chief executives say this is how we're going to do it, then that is what has to be done. But the engineers in the company, who actually knew a lot about cars, were very suspicious of this model. And part of the reason is that while in the computer industry, you kind of knew what the modules were, you know, there's a CPU and there's storage and there's all these different parts of the computer, and yes, you can just collect them from the different suppliers, put them together. It turned out that the engineers thought, and some of them even said, well, in a car, we don't actually quite know what the modules are. And companies that tried to do things that way ended up doing much worse than companies like Japanese automakers who knew better than to do that. Because one of the reasons that the people who said that you should adopt modular production in the auto industry was that then you wouldn't have to worry about having all these networks of people who knew each other across firms. You could just send them the blueprints and they make the thing and they give it to you, and you don't have to know each other or trust one another, because that's very complicated and takes too long, is messy. And it turns out that I only have 3 minutes. So how am I going to finish this discussion in 3 minutes? Well, let me tell you, first of all, that the automakers that tried to put cars together that way, it turned out to be a disaster. And by the middle 2000s, 2005, 2006, they had all abandoned it. And now that's no longer how cars are put together. And I think we have much safer cars as a result. So it turns out that we do need embedded actors, and whether embedded is a noun or a verb or an adjective, it turns out that it's very difficult to get away from that. And I think all of our speakers are well aware of that, and I think that that's why the things they said in response to the things I've written were not exactly, I think they're supposed to be critiques, but they were very friendly as critiques go. And I think that it turns out that no matter which way you turn, whether you talk about culture or networks or institutions or individuals, you can't get away from the fact that it's all embedded. So I leave you with that thought, and thank you very much for listening.
Hi, I'm Shruti. I'm senior. I'm graduate Harvard in Economics and Finance. Firstly, thank you so much for this. It was really helpful. And so my question is to Mr. Granovetter, of course. So you joked about citation versus royalties. But beyond metrics, when you look back at how your ideas have been used or misused in economics, sociology, or even tech, do you think the strength of big ties has kept its sociological heart, or has it been stripped of its moral or human code?
Well, it seems to be one of those papers that has entered the stream of common knowledge in the society. And you know, there are times that people talk about it in such a way as if it's just in the stream of common knowledge and they've forgotten who'd written it. So, but that's okay. I suppose that's the ultimate in flattery. I think that it's quite agnostic about what kinds of disciplines, what kinds of scholars, what kinds of questions can use these ideas. When I wrote the paper, I wasn't even thinking about what use is this for economic sociology. The field of economic sociology, at the time I wrote The Strength of Weak Ties, really barely existed. And I wasn't even thinking about it. The main reason I came to think about it eventually was because having done my PhD dissertation on the question of how people find jobs, and the reason I did it on that subject was because I wanted to study something where I thought social networks mattered. And it turns out that social networks matter quite a bit for how people find jobs. And once I figured that out, once I had studied that in some detail, it made me think, well, if that's such an important part of the economy, then maybe social networks matter in other parts of the economy, and maybe I should start thinking more about the rest of the economy. And at the same time, I was thinking that there were economists who were actually paying attention to what I had said, and they started looking around and thinking about whether social networks mattered in the economy, not just in finding jobs, but in all kinds of ways, like the business people getting together and getting organized in the way that Mark Mizruchi has talked about, and some of my other discussions here have talked about. So I think that ideas about social networks, like the ones in The Strength of Weak Ties, are really quite agnostic about who can use them. I think that people can use them for all kinds of questions. I think economists and sociologists are certainly have felt free to adapt the ideas and usually use them in a way that makes sense in terms of my original concepts. And I think that it turns out to be useful in all aspects of human life, political, economic, social. I don't think there's any particular reason why the ideas like that about social networks should be mainly useful to people in one discipline. I think that they are general enough. Humans form social networks for all kinds of reasons, economic, social, political reasons. And for that reason, any ideas like that are, I think, usable in all kinds of areas of study. So I hope that's a little bit of an answer for your question.
My question is for Kim. And hopefully it's an easy one. So if I'm picking up on Professor Granovetter.
You're not going to revoke the A I gave her, are you?
No, I do not. If you could choose one more country to add to your analysis, what would it be and why?
That's not an easy question. That's a great question, though. So I think a very reasonable critique of this book is that it focuses on one part of the world and neglects another very significant part of the world. So I focused on, I started with the case of the US because this is a case where there's been a lot written about financial regulation, and also what happens in the US had big ripple effects for what happened elsewhere in the world. And then I chose a case, Canada, that was very similar, and a case, Spain, that was very different from this pool of countries that were all following the same international regulatory standards. But I think some pushback that I've received, and I think rightfully so, is many countries have banking regulation outside of a traditional Western European or North American context. And I think it would be really interesting to see if the same sorts of processes which were showing up across these three contexts are also showing up in a context where countries aren't parties to the same international regulatory framework and trying to pave their own way in a world dominated by financial systems in Western Europe and North America and East Asia in this case. So
you think China might be your next case?
Maybe China. Thank you, Mark. Yes.